Good evening. Tonight is yours. Nothing left to finish. No more decisions to make. Just the quiet and a story slowly unfolding in the dark. Tonight, we follow one life. It started with no particular promise. A sickly boy in a rented house, a father he barely knew, a mother doing her best with very little. And it ended with 2 books that changed the way the world talks about power, about lies, and about what governments do to people when no one is watching. His name at birth was Eric Arthur Blair, but you know him by something else. Let your body settle now. Wherever you are, in bed, on a sofa, in whatever position means rest is coming, let your shoulders drop, your jaw go loose. We're going to move slowly through this one. History doesn't rush. It just keeps arriving, one quiet moment at a time. Now, let's begin at the beginning, which, for Eric Arthur Blair, was somewhere nobody expected anything remarkable at all. The place was Motihari, a small town in Bengal, part of the vast machinery of the British Empire in what is now the Indian state of Bihar. The date was June 25th, 1903. The house was modest, functional, forgettable, the kind of place the empire produced in abundance for its minor officials, with the monsoon still weeks away and the air thick with heat. Eric's father, Richard Walmsley Blair, worked for the Indian Civil Service as an agent in the Opium Department, the branch of the colonial bureaucracy that oversaw the legal opium trade between India and China. It was a respectable job by the standards of the day, not glamorous, not powerful, but steady. The kind of work that kept a family just above the waterline without ever letting them feel truly secure. His mother, Ida Mabel Limousin, was the daughter of a French teak merchant who had never quite made his fortune in Burma. She was 18 years younger than her husband, vivid, practical, the kind of woman who held things together without making a fuss about it. And the reason this matters is that the family's roots stretched in 2 directions, toward England and toward the East, and Eric would spend his whole life caught somewhere between those 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither. The year after he was born, Ida packed up. She took Eric and his older sister Marjorie and moved them back to England, to Henley-on-Thames, a quiet market town in Oxfordshire where the river slides past weeping willows and nothing much seems to happen. Richard Blair stayed behind in India. He didn't come home for another 3 years. Eric Blair spent the first crucial years of his life in an essentially fatherless house. He knew his father as a distant presence, someone who sent letters, who existed somewhere out there in the heat and the empire, but who was not there. When Richard finally retired and came home for good in 1912, Eric was already 9 years old. The 2 never really figured out how to be close. Orwell would later describe his father as dull and unimaginative. That is not a kind thing to say about your father. But Orwell was rarely kind when he thought he was telling the truth. As you breathe slowly now, the air in, the air out, imagine a boy of 5 or 6 in a rented house in Henley. Outside, the Thames moves past. The air smells of cut grass and river mud. He has a sister to play with, a mother who reads to him, a garden to wander in. It sounds peaceful, and in some ways, it was. But there was always a shadow to it, a sense that the family was performing a version of respectability it couldn't quite afford. Eric's mother called it the lower upper middle class. That phrase, which Eric would later use himself with the precision he brought to all social observations, tells you everything. They had the habits and expectations of people above them financially. But the money was never actually there. Eric's first word, according to family legend, was beastly. A child's earliest attempt at language, and he already sounds like a disappointed Edwardian. He was, from very early on, a reader, drawn to books the way some children are drawn to water, not because anyone told him to be, but because the world inside them was richer than the world outside. He read Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels and felt something unlock in him, the satire, the cruelty disguised as adventure, the way Swift used a story about tiny people and enormous people to say something devastating about power and human vanity. Eric filed that away, somewhere he couldn't name yet. He wrote his first poem around age 4, a poem about a tiger. By the time he was 11, his poem, Awake Young Men of England, was printed in the local Henley paper. He was already writing for an audience, already trying to make language do something, already, in some small way, becoming who he was going to be. And then came St. Cyprian's, the school that would shape him and hurt him and never quite let him go. St. Cyprian's was a prep school in Eastbourne on the Sussex coast, built to take boys from reasonably good families, polish them hard, and deliver them to Eton or Harrow or Winchester. Eric arrived in 1911 on a partial scholarship, and the school let him know, not directly, never directly, but in the particular way institutions have of making things clear without stating them, that he was there on sufferance, there on a discount, there to perform brilliantly and justify the arrangement. He was 8 years old. He was also a bedwetter. In a boarding school full of boys who had absorbed every available cruelty from their older brothers, this was catastrophic. He was punished, shamed, beaten with a cane on at least one occasion. He cried, and then learned not to cry, which is a different and more serious kind of damage. He wrote about all of this later in an essay called Such Were the Joys, one of the most searing pieces of prose he ever produced, a merciless account of what it feels like to be small and at the mercy of people who have decided your worth in advance. Let yourself breathe. The night is quiet around you. Whatever you carry from your own early years, whatever rooms you remember, whatever voices, just let them rest for now. They're part of you. You don't have to carry them actively tonight. Despite everything, Eric was brilliant. His marks were outstanding, his reading voracious, and he had the particular quality, which can be either a gift or a curse, of noticing things other people missed. He won a King's Scholarship to Eton in 1917, one of the most prestigious secondary schools in England. Eton was different from St. Cyprian's, less brutal, more relaxed, with more room to develop into actual people rather than machines for producing exam results. Eric, freed from the grinding anxiety of scholarship performance, relaxed, and his grades dropped. He stopped pushing, he wandered, he read whatever he wanted. Aldous Huxley, who would later write Brave New World, was one of his teachers, though it's not clear how much they actually connected. He left Eton in 1921 without a degree, not disgraced, but not distinguished either. The next step, the one every boy in his position was supposed to take, was university. But there was no money, and his academic record at Eton wasn't strong enough to win another scholarship. He stood at a dead end, 19 years old, the son of a colonial civil servant, educated at 2 of England's great schools, with no clear path forward. The Empire was the obvious option, It was what his father had done, what the family's entire history pointed toward. He sat the exam for the Indian Imperial Police. He passed. He asked to be posted to Burma. In October 1922, Eric Arthur Blair sailed east, back toward the part of the world he'd been born near, back into the Empire, into the heat and bamboo forests and river deltas, and the whole vast apparatus of British colonial rule. He was 19 years old. Eric Blair arrived as an assistant superintendent of police. He learned the language, learned the work, and learned, gradually and then all at once, that he hated everything it required of him. As a police officer, his job was to maintain order, to represent the Empire's authority, to be a person of standing and a representative of the power that ran everything. He wore the uniform and carried out the duties. He attended executions. One execution stayed with him for the rest of his life. He watched a Burmese prisoner being walked to the gallows, a small man in white clothes, still handcuffed. The prisoner stepped slightly to one side, to avoid a puddle. In that single, automatic, entirely human gesture, the reflex to keep one's feet dry even when walking toward death, something cracked open in Eric Blair. He saw with sudden clarity what it meant to destroy a healthy, conscious human being. He wrote about it years later in an essay called A Hanging. The other incident, the one that became, perhaps, even more famous, was an elephant. And this is where things get interesting. A working elephant had gone must and run amok in a village, crushing a man to death. Eric was called, borrowed a rifle, and found the elephant in a field, now calm, eating grass. The animal was clearly no longer dangerous. Shooting it made no practical sense. But there was a crowd of Burmese villagers watching him, 2,000 of them perhaps. In that crowd's gaze, he suddenly understood something about imperial power that no one had explained to him clearly before. He had to shoot the elephant not because it needed shooting, but because the crowd expected a sahib to shoot it. His authority, his uniform, the whole apparatus of empire depended on performing the role. The moment a sahib looked uncertain or merciful in the wrong way, the illusion wobbled. He shot the elephant. The animal took a long time to die. He wrote about it in 1936 in the essay Shooting an Elephant, and in it he described standing there with the rifle, realizing he was no longer the one doing the deciding. The crowd was deciding for him. The role was deciding for him. He was trapped as the Burmese people were trapped, just in a different and more comfortable cell. That insight, the idea that power corrupts the powerful as surely as it oppresses the powerless, would become the foundation of everything he later wrote. He stayed in Burma for nearly 5 years. He contracted dengue fever. His lungs, always fragile, began to trouble him. He grew thin, angular, and increasingly miserable. In the summer of 1927, he came home to England on medical leave, walked into his family's house in Southwold on the Suffolk coast, sat down and thought carefully about what he was doing with his life. He decided he was not going back. He was done with the empire, done with the uniform, done with being the instrument of something he despised. He resigned from the Indian Imperial Police in January 1928. He was 24 years old, with no money, no connections in the literary world, no published work of any significance, and no plan beyond the conviction that writing was the only thing that would let him look at himself honestly. What followed was years of grinding, uncomfortable obscurity, which gave him, as it turned out, everything he would later need. He moved to London, then to Paris. He spent months living in rooms barely bigger than closets, eating cheaply, scraping for work. In Paris, he worked for a period as a plongeur, a dishwasher, in a grand hotel. Hours standing at a sink in a basement, the kitchen thundering above, the floors slick with grease. He watched the other men, migrants, drifters, people society had filed away as unimportant, and he paid close attention. But that's not all. Back in London, he went further. He put on old clothes deliberately and walked into the East End, slept in cheap lodging houses among the homeless, tramped the roads with itinerant workers, followed the annual migration of hop pickers down to Kent. He was doing something calculated, gathering material, learning, but he was also doing penance. He had spent 5 years enforcing colonial power over people who had no choice. Now he was choosing to understand what powerlessness felt like from the inside. Whether that fully works as moral accounting is a question he probably wrestled with himself. He was honest enough to know it didn't entirely. He was writing through all of this, sending pieces to literary magazines, getting rejected, sending more pieces, getting rejected again. The literary world in London in the late 1920s had little interest in an unknown writer with opinions about poverty and colonialism. He kept going anyway, which was one of his most defining qualities, a stubborn persistence that was not quite confidence, but something quieter and harder to shake. By 1931, he had a manuscript. He called it A Scullion's Diary, then revised it as Down and Out in Paris and London. He sent it to publishers. Victor Gollancz rejected it. T.S. Eliot, then an editor at Faber and Faber, rejected it too. Eliot would reject Orwell twice in his life, and both times he was wrong. This is worth stating plainly. One of the greatest poets of the century read George Orwell twice, and both times decided to pass. History has a sense of humor. A literary agent named Leonard Moore eventually took the manuscript on, and Victor Gollancz, the same Gollancz who had previously rejected it, agreed to publish it on one condition. The author had to use a pen name. He proposed 4 names. George Orwell was the one he and his publisher settled on. George, a plain English name. Orwell from the River Orwell in Suffolk, a river he had walked along and loved. It sounded real, unpretentious, rooted in English soil. Eric Arthur Blair became George Orwell in January 1933. He was 30 years old. He had found his voice. Now all he needed was an audience. Down and Out in Paris and London was published in January 1933. The reviews were respectful, the sales modest. It was not a sensation, but it was in the world. He followed it with Burmese Days, then A Clergyman's Daughter, then Keep the Aspidistra Flying, a novel about a bookseller's assistant trying to escape the commercial world and write poetry instead, failing, and eventually capitulating to ordinary life. That last one is bitterly funny in places and nakedly autobiographical. The hero is trapped between his principles and his need to survive, which was not a problem Orwell was only imagining. Around 1933, while teaching to make ends meet, he had his first serious bout of pneumonia, which was later revealed to have been an early sign of tuberculosis. He recovered enough to keep working. But his lungs were marked now. The disease was in him, slow and patient, waiting for its moment. He was also falling in love with writing in a way that had outgrown ambition. He wasn't writing to become famous, or even particularly to be read. As he would explain years later in his essay, Why I Write, there were lies he needed to expose, facts he needed to push into the light, a world he needed to describe accurately before the authorities managed to describe it falsely. As the night deepens around you, the room dark, the world outside quieter now, think about what that means. Writing not to impress, not to entertain, but to tell the truth. To say clearly and precisely what is actually happening in a world that keeps insisting the official version is the only one. That's a specific and lonely kind of calling. Orwell had it, and it didn't make his life easy, comfortable, or safe. But it made his life matter in a way that very few writers' lives do. In 1936, two things happened that would change George Orwell completely. He married Eileen O'Shaughnessy, and he went to Spain. Eileen was a graduate of Oxford, a poet, a sharp and funny woman who had been studying educational psychology at University College London when they met at a party in Bloomsbury in 1935. She could keep up with him intellectually and wasn't intimidated by his opinions, which were numerous and forceful. They married in June 1936 in the village of Wallington in Hertfordshire, where they'd rented a small cottage with a garden. He grew vegetables. She managed the household. He wrote Road to Wigan, Pier. Orwell spent weeks in the north of England, in Sheffield and Wigan and nearby towns, going down coal mines, visiting workers' homes, interviewing unemployed men, documenting the particular grimness of industrial poverty in the 1930s. The first half is some of the most powerful documentary writing in the English language. Men crawling through underground tunnels described with such physical precision that you feel the claustrophobia in your chest, the smell of miners' houses, the composition of a poor family's weekly diet, the weight of a coal tub. Specific, exact, and devastating. The second half of the book turned on the left and said things they didn't want to hear. He argued that middle-class socialists didn't actually like working-class people very much, that they liked the idea of them, and that a peculiar condescension ran through British socialism that made it unattractive to the people it was supposedly for. He was right. And being right about something your own side doesn't want to hear is a particular Orwellian specialty. Then Spain. The Civil War had begun in 1936. General Francisco Franco, backed by Hitler and Mussolini, had risen against the elected Republican government. Across Europe, the left saw Spain as the fight, the clear moral confrontation between fascism and something better. Orwell looked at it and felt, for perhaps the first time in his life, a simple and direct desire to do something physical about something political. He went in December 1936. He joined a militia and was stationed on the Aragon front in the hills outside Huesca. He spent months in the trenches. Not dramatic trenches, dull ones. Freezing cold, short of ammunition, plagued by lice, and bored in the particular way that warfare is mostly boredom punctuated by terror. He liked it. That's the strange thing. He wrote later that for the first time in years he felt something like genuine equality around him. In the trenches, a man with a rifle was a man with a rifle. The revolutionary Barcelona he'd arrived in had a quality he had never encountered before. A city, briefly, without the usual hierarchies grinding everyone into their assigned position. Then, In May 1937, he was shot. A fascist sniper from approximately 175 yards put a bullet through his throat. The bullet missed his carotid artery by millimeters. He survived, barely. His voice was damaged and would never fully recover, and the wound left him weak and shaken in ways that took months to work through. But what happened next was, in some ways, worse than the bullet. After the wounding, Orwell was pulled back to Barcelona to recover. Barcelona in May 1937 was in the middle of a different kind of war. The Soviet-backed communist faction had begun systematically suppressing the other groups on the Republican side. Orwell's militia was accused of being secretly allied with Franco, a specific, deliberate, politically convenient lie. POUM members were being arrested, imprisoned, tortured, killed. Orwell and Eileen narrowly escaped. They fled to France. Orwell returned to England in June 1937, 34 years old, a bullet wound still healing in his throat. What Spain had given him was not what he'd expected. He had gone looking for a clear moral war, and found a morally complex one. A movement that called itself socialist, but was willing to lie, imprison, and murder to maintain its power. He had seen, from the inside, how a revolutionary movement could betray everything it claimed to stand for, how the language of liberation could become the language of control, how history could be rewritten in real time by the people who controlled the newspapers. Every line of serious work he wrote after that, he later said, was aimed at totalitarianism, not just fascism. Any system that put power over truth. Let yourself drift a little now. Let the story soften around the edges. As you breathe slowly, in and out, the rhythm like a tide, hear that settle. He came back changed, not broken, changed. As if the lens through which he saw the world had been cleaned, and now everything was sharper, more uncomfortable, and also, finally, more honest. The years between Spain and Animal Farm were years of slow productivity and declining health. He wrote homage to Catalonia, his account of the Spanish War, in 1938. It sold fewer than 1,000 copies in his lifetime. Publishers were nervous about its politics. It was too honest about Soviet behavior in Spain at a time when the left wanted its stories simple, too uncomfortable, too accurate for the moment it arrived in. He went to Morocco for his health in 1938 and 1939. The dry air was supposed to help his lungs, and it helped somewhat. He wrote Coming Up for Air, a novel about a middle-aged man trying to revisit his childhood village and finding it swallowed by modernity. Quiet, elegiac, and largely ignored. The Second World War began in September 1939. Orwell wanted desperately to fight. His health made it impossible. The medical board rejected him. He organized a local Home Guard unit, wrote reviews, essays, and journalism, contributed to the left-wing press. He produced broadcasts for the BBC's Indian section. He hated the BBC job. It was bureaucratic, inefficient, and it felt like trying to reach people with a megaphone pointed at a wall. He lasted 2 years. But the reason this period matters is that something was quietly taking shape in him during those same wasted years. A story, a fable, small animals on a farm, a revolution that ate itself. He sat down and wrote Animal Farm between November 1943 and February 1944. 3 months. The The story was already fully formed inside him, and it came out clean, a fable about farm animals overthrowing their human master and establishing their own government, which then reproduces, step by step and word by word, all the tyrannies of the regime it replaced. Pigs gradually becoming indistinguishable from men. The commandments of the revolution rewritten in the night. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. It was unmistakably about Stalin, about what had happened to the Russian Revolution, about how power does not care what banner flies above it. He sent it to publishers. Victor Gollancz refused immediately. Britain was allied with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany, and this was not the time to publish something that made Stalin look like a villain. Jonathan Cape agreed to publish it, and then changed his mind after a conversation with someone at the British Ministry of Information, who made clear the government would prefer he didn't. T.S. Eliot at Faber and Faber read the manuscript and sent back one of the most famous rejection letters in literary history. He praised the writing, admired the craft, and said Faber had no conviction that it was the right point of view from which to criticize the political situation. He added that the pigs, being the cleverest animals, were really the best qualified to run the farm, so the book's argument wasn't entirely convincing. Eliot was a genius. He was completely wrong. After Gollancz, Cape, Eliot, and several American publishers who said animal stories don't sell, Frederick Warburg of Secker and Warburg took it on. Paper shortages delayed publication until August 1945. By then, the war was over. The wartime alliance had begun to fray, and Animal Farm landed in a world that was, for the first time, ready to hear what it was saying. It became a sensation almost immediately, but Eileen didn't live to see it. She had died in March 1945 during what was supposed to be routine surgery for a uterine tumor. She was 39 years old. She had encouraged him to go to France as a war correspondent the previous month, and he had gone. He was in Germany when she died. The telegram found him there. Whatever private world they had built together, the cottage in Wallington, the vegetables, the small domestic life around which everything else had arranged itself, was suddenly and permanently gone. He was left with a 2-year-old adopted son named Richard and a grief that he didn't discuss publicly and may never have fully processed at all. The night around you is very quiet now. Let yourself feel that quiet as something kind rather than empty. History is full of losses. Every life contains them. Eric Blair lost his wife at 39, with his greatest work still ahead of him, and his body already beginning to fail. He just kept writing, because there was nothing else to do, and because the writing was perhaps the only place where things made the kind of sense he needed them to make. In the spring of 1946, Orwell moved to an island. Not metaphorically, literally. To Jura, one of the Inner Hebridean islands off the west coast of Scotland, one of the most remote inhabited places in Britain. To get there from London, you took a train to Glasgow, then another train to a ferry, then a boat to Jura, then a taxi to the northern tip of the island, then walked several more miles to a farmhouse called Barnhill. Barnhill was barely habitable by most accounts. The walls were damp, the roof needed work, the plumbing was unreliable, and it was cold even in summer. Orwell brought his sister Avril, young Richard's nanny, eventually Richard himself, and a typewriter, and a very specific idea for a book. The book had been forming in him since Spain, maybe longer. a novel about a world in which the revolution has succeeded completely, in which the state has perfected its control of language, of memory, of the very thoughts people are allowed to think, in which the past is not merely recorded but actively managed, rewritten, erased, remade to serve the present. 2 + 2 = 5, if the party requires it. He called the working title The Last Man in Europe. Eventually, he inverted the last 2 digits of the year he was writing, 1948, to produce the title 1984. He wrote it with his body failing under him. The tuberculosis, dormant or manageable for years, was no longer either. He was coughing up blood, losing weight, his lungs deteriorating. His doctors told him to stop working, to rest, to take care of himself. He worked anyway. Under orders to write no more than an hour a day, he sat at his typewriter for 10-hour stretches, burning whatever was left of his health against the book he needed to finish. There is something almost unbearable about imagining it. A dying man on a remote Scottish island, the Atlantic visible from the farmhouse windows, rain most of the time, the island smelling of peat and wet heather, typing into existence one of the darkest visions of human society ever put on paper. Room 101, the thought police, the memory hole, Big Brother watching, doublethink, the ability to hold 2 contradictory beliefs simultaneously and believe both of them. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face, forever. In the summer of 1947, he also nearly drowned. He took Richard and a few friends out in a small boat, got caught by a whirlpool near a rocky outcrop called the Corryvreckan, one of the largest tidal whirlpools in the world, and had to swim to a rocky islet after the boat's outboard motor was lost. They were rescued by a passing fisherman. Swimming in cold Scottish water was not something his lungs needed. He finished the first draft of 1984 in November 1947 and then immediately collapsed. He was admitted to Hairmyres Hospital in East Kilbride, where he spent most of 1948. His biographers have noted that the descriptions of torture in 1984's Ministry of Love bear certain structural resemblances to the medical procedures he was undergoing. The body reduced to its bare, suffering minimum. The self stripped down to pain and then reassembled. He was writing it and living a version of it simultaneously. He was discharged in the summer of 1948 and returned to Jura to revise the manuscript. Unable to find a typist willing to travel to a remote Hebridean island, he typed it himself. The effort nearly killed him. He collapsed when it was done. His fishing rods sat in the corner of his bedroom. The manuscript went to his publisher. 1984 was published on June 8, 1949. It was an immediate and world-transforming success. Totalitarian, memory hole, doublethink, newspeak, Big Brother. Those words didn't exist in English before he wrote them. The concepts had existed in Stalin's Russia, in Hitler's Germany, in every system that had tried to control its citizens by controlling what they were allowed to say and think. But the words hadn't. And the reason this matters is that once you have the words, you can see the thing more clearly. And once you can see it clearly, it's harder to pretend it isn't there. He married Sonia Brownell in September 1949. She was an editorial assistant at the literary magazine Horizon, 31 years old to his 46. He was in University College Hospital in London by then, bedridden and thin and very clearly dying. There were plans, possibly hopeful, possibly delusional, for a trip to a sanatorium in the Swiss Alps. His fishing rods had been brought to the hospital room. He had been writing lists of books he wanted to read. He was still making plans. He died on January 21st, 1950. A blood vessel in his lung burst in the night. He was 46 years old. His fishing rods were still in the corner. He was buried in the churchyard of All Saints in Sutton Courtenay, Oxfordshire, under his birth name, not George Orwell. Eric Arthur Blair. The name on the headstone is the one his mother gave him, in a small house in a hot city in Bengal, in the summer of 1903. The grave is simple, no long inscription, just the name, the dates, and the words. Here lies Eric Arthur Blair. What he left behind is harder to summarize than a gravestone allows. Animal Farm and 1984 are still in print everywhere. They are assigned in schools across dozens of countries and have been translated into more than 60 languages. They outlived the Soviet Union. They were written partly to critique. Every decade or so, someone notes that sales of 1984 have spiked again, because whatever particular government or event is prompting the spike, people reach for it, as if the book is a kind of gauge, a way of measuring how bad things actually are. The word Orwellian has entered the language as a permanent fixture, meaning specifically a society or system in which power maintains itself through surveillance, propaganda, and the systematic manipulation of language and truth. You hear it used by people who have never read a word Orwell wrote, because the concept has become inseparable from everyday political speech. That is what it looks like when a writer changes the language. The words outlive the man who made them. His essays are, if anything, underrated, which is nearly impossible given how highly regarded he already is. Politics and the English language remains one of the best pieces ever written about how bad writing serves bad politics, about how vague, abstract, inflated language allows governments and institutions to say nothing clearly while creating the impression of having said something important. His rules for writing: use concrete words, not abstract ones. Cut any phrase you have used before. Never use a long word where a short one will do. Remain the best available advice for anyone trying to write clearly and honestly. He practiced what he said. His prose is almost completely free of decorative obscurity. He wrote the way a carpenter builds, for the thing to hold. He was not entirely admirable. He held views on women that were more conventional than his politics suggested they ought to be. Near the end of his life, he submitted a list of what he considered crypto-communist sympathizers to a British government information service, a fact that has generated controversy ever since. He had affairs. He was sometimes difficult. The temptation with Orwell, more than with almost any other modern writer, is to turn him into a saint of clear prose and political conscience. He was very much not a saint. He was a man who smoked too much, coughed too much, got things wrong, felt the push and pull of loyalty and truth, and chose truth so consistently that it became the most defining thing about him. Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936, he wrote in 1946, has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism as I understand it. That is as clear a statement of purpose as any writer has ever made about their own work. He knew what he was doing and why he was doing it. He just kept doing it until his body stopped. And so tonight, as the room grows quiet around you, and your breathing slows, and the edges of the day finally fade, think for a moment about what it means to tell the truth in a world that prefers the comfortable version. Eric Blair was a sickly boy in a rented house in Oxfordshire, with a father he barely knew and a class position just precarious enough to make him permanently observant. He became George Orwell, a name taken from a river, and he spent his working life making things visible that powerful people wanted invisible. The inside of a coal mine, the logic of colonialism, the mechanism by which a revolution poisons itself, the specific grammar of totalitarian language. He did it while ill, while broke, while ignored, then famous, while grieving, while dying. The fishing rods in the corner of the hospital room, the headstone with the birth name, the words that are still, 7 decades later, part of how we talk about power. History is made of people like that. People who are not particularly lucky, who are not necessarily comfortable, who have no guarantee of being heard, and who write the true thing anyway. Because the true thing needs to be written, and someone has to be the one to do it. Sleep well tonight. Let yourself rest completely. The world is still there in the morning, with all its noise and complexity and need. But tonight, it can wait. Tonight, there's just the dark, and the quiet, and the memory of one man's life, burning through itself like a candle in a cold room, giving off light, long after it was gone.